Did you, dear viewer, know there's a map of Berserk's world in the manga itself? I sure didn't until I looked it up. Man, I was not prepared for what I found. Truth be told, I'm not even sure how I missed it during my first read-through. Perhaps it was due to my attention being directed at the giant explosion which takes up the majority of the page. Or I just wanted to repress the truth. Regardless of what happened, I realized, after it was pointed out to me, something which raised a ton of questions. So, do you see it? Yep, that's Iberia. And yep, that's Sicily and Sardinia. Berserk's world is our own. However, I suspect most of you already knew that, which really does call into question why I named this video what I did. I'll be upfront with this. I'm not talking about the overall themes or driving motivations which are central to Berserk's story, nor am I talking about the mechanics of magic or the laws of causality which govern how the world works. Instead, I'm talking about the planet itself and the countries which reside in it. Or, to put that in simpler terms, I'm going to be doing what I can to determine where the fuck the countries we know about are. I'm going to make a map. So, ladies, gentlemen, and bastards born beneath the hangman's noose, I'm Bufar191, and this is Nobody Understands the World of Berserk. Truth be told, I myself am among the nobody and nobody understands because the entire video is just one big piece of speculation. It's one big guess. Having said that though, I'm not just pulling everything I'm talking about out of my ass. There's reasoning and points to my conclusions, which I'm going to go on at length explaining. Unlike other pieces of fantasy, like let's say, screw it, Goblin Slayer because of that one video I did, Berserk has a pretty firm grasp on actual European history. On the surface, this is fairly evident with details like the military equipment, architecture, fashion, and politics of the setting. They are all rooted pretty firmly in reality and fit within the time period that Miura wants to portray. Much like George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, if one was to remove the fantastical elements of Berserk, then you'd be left with a world that is near identical to our own, with only a few exceptions. So, keeping that in mind, if we compare our own history to that of the world of Berserk, then a lot of questions pertaining to the subject matter can be answered. To put it simply, Berserk is set during the Middle Ages, the medieval period, at approximately 13 to 1500 AD. I want to make this clear because as we go forward, things are going to get a bit messy. It's nice to have a foundation so confusion can be avoided as much as possible. During this point in European history, the 100 Years' War between France and England was going on, a conflict which is paralleled in the 100 Years' War between Midland and Tudor, also known as Tudor. Though European armies weren't professional in the sense of how we think of the word today, they were becoming more professional. The levied soldiers of the English army, such as their longbowmen, are an example of the slow drift away from the traditional feudal warfare as technology developed. To coincide with this, the 100 Years' War between France and England also saw the rise of free companies, which were roaming mercenary bands, something that is a pretty big plot point in Berserk. Basically, warfare was still feudal with lords and knights, however the transition to every nation having a regular standing army had begun. I also say the time period is 1300 to 1500 due to the tactics and equipment we see used. Cannons are being widely employed by Midland forces in many of their battles, and we often see the armies of Berserk, especially in the battles against Nosferatu Zod and Ganishka, use the pike and shot formation, with the only difference between the real world being the substitution of early firearms for crossbows. It's important to understand that Berserk takes place during this time because determining the location of the setting's countries is reliant upon our own real world history. If a country from Berserk shares culture and history with a real world country, then they most likely share a location as well. Kicking this off, we're going to start with Midland because it is the most difficult to address. As the country's name would imply, Midland is a middle land. As Charlotte explains during the rescue of Griffith, long ago the continent was made up of constantly warring tribes and city-states until the appearance of Supreme King Geyserreich. I may have said that wrong, but Geyserreich just sounds really cool. So I'm gonna roll with it. The king who wore a skull-shaped helmet into battle subjugated every nation and created the first and possibly only empire which stretched the continent. There were no records of what country he came from or what he did prior to becoming an absolute mad lad. However, after his death, the empire split apart. Midland, which contained the ruins of his capital, would be the nation that emerged, which dwelt in the empire's heartlands. This empire which Geiselreich created sounds like a few different civilizations which cropped up over the course of European history, namely, the Roman Empire. No, not that one, or even that one, but this one, the Carolingian Empire, as it was created by the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne. Becoming king of the Franks in 768, Charlemagne waged a series of wars and extended his borders from modern-day France to the northern parts of Iberia and Italy, as well as into much of what is considered modern-day Germany. After his death in 814, Charlemagne's empire would eventually divide, due in part to the 843 Treaty of Verdun, which separated the realm into 3 smaller kingdoms. Long story short, Gavelkind succession is a bitch. The first split of the Carolingian Empire would result in the creation of West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia. There would be further divisions in the future as Middle Francia was further divided into Lotharingia, Italy, and Burgundy. However, that, as well as the other crazy nonsense that comes with the Carolingian Empire, isn't important for what we're talking about. The reason I state that Geiselreich's empire was based off the Carolingian Empire as opposed to the Roman Empire proper comes down to this one panel and the context of said empire. The helmets, weapons, shields, and armor all look like they are from the early medieval period between the years of 700 and 1000 AD. The settlement in the background looks a lot like a cross between an early medieval city and a Motte and Bailey style castle, which, admittedly, didn't crop up until after or around the fall of the Carolingian Empire. It has more in common with the early medieval period than the ancient period, is all I'm saying. If Geiselreich's empire had more in common with Rome, then the land wouldn't have been just a bunch of warring tribes. There would have been larger civilizations, comparatively, that would have stood in Geiselreich's way of conquest. In the ancient period, things were a bit more centralized, even among the Gauls, than after the fall of Rome, where hosts of migrating tribes were storming through Western Europe. I'd wager that Midland is about located where Middle Francia and Lotharingia are, based off of the premise that A, the location of the explosion on Chapter 305 is around this region, B, Geiselreich and his empire appears to be heavily based off of Charlemagne's due to their similarities and circumstance for their ascent. And C, when Geiselreich's empire fell, Midland consisted of the lands that were in the middle of the empire, hence its name, which lines up pretty well with Middle Francia. I will state there are some weaknesses to this. The first is that Geiselreich's achievements were 1,000 years ago according to Charlotte, where Charlemagne's were about 500 to 700 years ago. The other weakness is architecture. On Chapter 53, we do see some of the remnants of Geiselreich's capital city, which seem Roman or Hellenic in origin. Having said that though, I still think the Carolingian Empire best fits the world of Berserk, especially when one factors in the politics of the setting. Now it's time to move on to the Kushan. Don't worry guys, this will take substantially less time, due in part to the fact there's so little written on the rest of the nations. However, before going on, I want to state something which I find amazing. If we assume Geiselreich is Charlemagne, who was king of the Franks, the king of France, and if we assume Skull Knight is Geiselreich, then that means Skull Knight is Charlemagne. That means Skull Knight is French. Please, everyone, from now on, when you read a scene with Skull Knight, imagine he speaks with a French accent. I don't know what that will do, but please try it. The Kushan Empire, put simply, is the Ottoman Empire, and Ganishka is, essentially, Suleiman the Magnificent, though I do feel that's a bit unfair to Suleiman. Just for a frame of reference, the Ottomans were pretty deep into Europe by 1520. They laid siege to Vienna on 1529 and had fought and would keep fighting their Christian neighbors for centuries to come. I say the Ottomans specifically instead of a people like the Moors in North Africa and Iberia due to the fact they came from the East. The Kushan's aesthetic and the religious threat they pose to the Holy See lines up pretty well with an Islamic caliphate. The Ottomans were in power between 13 to 1500 AD, and they were pushing into Europe much like the Kushan. So the Kushan are the Ottomans, hence the location. Now it's on to Tudor, or Tudor as they are also called. There's not a lot to go on with them. However, there is something I have to address. Their name. I am fully aware that the House of Tudor exists, and for those who don't know, the Tudors were a royal house of England, responsible for several rulers, including Queen Elizabeth I. Having said that though, I do not believe Tudor is England. I am fully aware of the 100 Years' War connection. However, as we've established using proof from the manga itself, Midland is not France. The connection, as it relates to geography, isn't as cut and dry as that. The main reason why I do not believe Tudor, which is what I'm going to call it from here on out, is England, comes down to the existence of another nation, which I think fits that role much better. I have no idea how to pronounce it, so I'm just gonna call it Lith. But we'll get there next. If I had to place Tudor anywhere, it would be in West Francia, or France, due to the 100 Years' War. The conflict between Midland and Tudor was prolonged and extremely bloody if the Golden Age arc is anything to go by. It didn't have the bouts of peace like the real 100 Years' War, which leads me to believe the two countries shared a border. It's just easier for one to attack another even during times of temporary peace due to the lack of a natural barrier like an ocean. I say West Francia specifically instead of East Francia due to the relationships and technology the nation I put in East Francia has. I'll explain more when I get there. Basically, Tudor is in West Francia because it makes warfare against Midland significantly easier, and it doesn't quite fit anywhere else because the places it could go are occupied by nations that make much more sense. Now on to Lith. Again, I know I'm saying that wrong. Even though this country isn't all that fleshed out, we do have a basic understanding of it through the lens of one particular character, Roderick. What we learn through this character is this. Lith is on the northern frontier, is surrounded by water, has a history of shipbuilding and seafaring, and is relatively secluded from the going-ons of the other Holy See nations. We also know that Roderick wants to explore and get a foothold into unexplored lands because he believes those who conquer what hasn't been found will be the conquerors of the age. I believe Lith is Britain for several reasons. The first is the Isle's location relative to the rest of Europe. It's in the north, and is secluded from the rest of the continent at large, which ties into the seclusion Roderick mentions. The second is the country's navy. Britain, come the late medieval period, early modern period, would be developing and eventually be known for its navy. The third reason is exploration and colonization, something which Roderick states he wants to push his country into doing. By exploring new lands and colonizing them, Britain would go on to become the largest empire in human history. The country would go on to dominate much of the modern age. Even though Lith isn't currently doing that, it's clear there are individuals who want to, like Roderick. Another possible location for Lith is Scandinavia. However, I don't believe that location fits because the nations which dwelt there wouldn't be known for their colonization in the same way Britain would be. I also want to state that Elfhelm is on the island of Skellig, a location that has a real-world counterpart off the coast of Ireland. Also, Roderick mentions that though Lith is a part of the Holy See, the country is of a different sect, which mirrors the English Anglican Church, which was established in the mid-1500s. So, bearing all that in mind, this is why I place Lith in Britain. Now we're at the point where the nations of Berserk just have a single panel dedicated to them, and that's it. So the explanations are going to be a hell of a lot more brief because there is very little to work with. First, there's the Kingdom of Baldin. I believe this country best fits the location of East Francia, Germany, the Holy Roman Empire that isn't the Carolingian Empire, for two reasons. The first comes down to what Serpico mentions concerning the nation's military, their equipment. Just from this one panel, we can see their armor is reminiscent of Gothic plate, a style of armor developed by the Holy Roman Empire in the 1400s, which would be used into the 1500s. The second reason comes down to the only insight we get into another nation, that being the Kingdom of Randall, or the Randall Commonwealth. which we're going to move on to and then swing back around. What we know about Randall is this. They won their independence from Britain, and used to be a penal colony which resettled the region's wetlands. There's very little to go on, however, I believe Randall is Bohemia. This comes down to both the region's environment, there are wetlands, and the fact Bohemia was at one point a part of the Holy Roman Empire. To bring this back around to Baldwin, if Randall is Bohemia, then it makes sense that Baldwin is East Francia, because the two regions would be closely connected, allowing for a more coherent border, which, admittedly, didn't always exist in the medieval period. Screams and Habsburgs. Actually, now that I think about it, Bohemia would go on to have ties with the Habsburg Empire, so maybe Randall is also Spain, a region left remarkably vacant in Berserk's world. That aside, it's time to move on. The next country we have is in fact two countries, Morgar and Wallatoria. The only things we know about these two nations is that they are the farthest east Holy See nations, and that they fought the Kushan many times before. This doesn't give us a lot, however it gives us enough to work with. The fact Serpico mentions these two nations in the same panel suggests they have close ties to one another, and it's pretty clear that these two nations are intent on removing Kebab. In European history, this sounds a lot like Poland and Lithuania, or even Poland and Hungary. In 1385, the Grand Duke of Lithuania married Jadwiga. Man, I can't do Polish names. The female ruler of Poland, which led to an alliance between the two people that would eventually spawn the more formal union of the two nations into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I just breezed through centuries of complicated history. I know it didn't happen like that, but I'm stating it this way just for the sake of brevity. From 1450 to 1721, Poland and Lithuania would fight a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. They'd fight against people invading from the east a lot. When the winter stars arrive! Poland and Hungary would also fight together against the Ottomans. However, I lean more towards the idea that Morgar and Wallatoria are Poland and Lithuania, mostly due to the implied connection from Serpico. There's not a lot to go off of, however, I think it lines up pretty well. Should note there's a Morag Poland, but that's the only connection the fictional names had with their possible real-world regions. Now it's on to the Paneria Alliance, the Panera Alliance. This is actually straightforward. The alliance is made up of rich city-states that don't have a standing army, but use mercenaries to do their fighting. This lines up with the Italian city-states of the medieval period like Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa, etc. These cities were oftentimes independent, and if they went to war, would rely upon mercenaries as witnessed with the Italian Wars, which took place between 1494 to 1559. The Paneria Alliance sounds like the Italy of this time, so I'm putting it in Italy. To wrap this up, I want to pin down a few smaller locations which are important to Berserk. The first is the Holy See. Clearly, the religion is based off of the Catholic Church, so it makes sense that the Holy City is in Rome. The only issue I have with this is significance. In the real world, this location being important makes sense. It was the capital of the Roman Empire and home to the Vatican. However, for Berserk, this doesn't quite work. We just don't know enough about the setting's history to definitively put the Holy City in Rome. To further complicate this, we know Farnese, I'm saying Farnese because that's how I read it, lived in the family mansion that was in the Holy City. We also know her family holds major sway over the city of Veritanus, the city where the armies of the Holy See were mustering. I've seen some people online think that Veritanus and the capital of the Holy See are the same place, however, I'm not entirely sold. I always got the impression it was a different place, though I could have missed something. Having said that though, due to Farnese's last name being de Vandemian, I cannot pronounce names, a name which is very similar to the name de Medici, the name of an important Italian family which made vast fortunes off of trade and banking, I'd wager Veritanus is based off of the important Italian city-states of the medieval period. Now, the go-to cities which come to mind are Florence or Venice. However, I'd motion for a different location, Genoa. Veritanus is a major seaport that can house all the ships the nations of the Holy See came in on. Genoa is the largest Italian seaport by area. To further the similarities, the terrain of both cities is fairly rough, hilly, and mountainous, while also being on the coast. Not a lot to go on. However, I will note Veritanus does lack the canals and flooding of Venice, which does help my thinking that it's Genoa. If the holy city of the Holy See is in fact Veritanus, then Genoa is said holy city. If not, then there's no harm placing it in Rome. Since I can't say one way or the other, I'm just going to place it in Rome for the time being. Throughout this video, I've been using a map of 800s Europe just to show off the Carolingian Empire split to keep Midland consistent. However, this new map you're seeing is what I think more or less the world of Berserk looks when accounting for things such as Midland's conflict with the Kushan and the explosion which spawned this video in the first place. This isn't exact, and I kinda had to frankenfuck a few different European medieval maps just to make something somewhat sensible that takes into account all I've talked about. Again, this was all speculation and essentially one big guess. However, I hope my reasoning made sense. I really like maps in fantasy settings because they help ground the world and provide context for the character's journey, hence why I took the time to make one. Oddly enough, it does explain, at least I think, the map explains, why the boat ride took so long. They had to travel a long fucking way. But with that said, guys, I've been Bufar191. Some final notes. The borders on the map can probably shift and alter them a bit, especially from Midland and Baldwin, because I think Baldwin would have more territory in the east, less in the west, and Midland would have more territory in the east, you know, kind of eating up Baldwin's territory. But I wanted to keep it as close to the initial Treaty of Verdun split, just to coincide with the Carolingian Empire. For those of you who may or may not be Bohemian, you know, live in Bohemia, or be a Bohemian ancestry, that's the word. Sorry if I put it in the wrong location. It's really kind of difficult to eyeball it, so yeah, shift it around as you will. But having said that, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope my reasoning has made sense. If my voice sounds bad, it's because I'm also sick while recording this with a pretty awful sore throat, on top of the sore throat I get while talking for too long. So, it's been a time. But having said that, I've been Bufar191. I'll see all of you guys next time. Goodbye.